Global trade is undergoing profound change as economies grapple with shifting supply chains, rapid advances in artificial intelligence, and the transition to cleaner energy. We are now coming to you from the Summer Davos Forum in Dalian, where policymakers, business leaders, and academics from around the world are discussing how to navigate these transformations. At this year's forum in Dalian, one key question is how these changes will affect workers and whether they will create new opportunities or deepen existing challenges. To discuss the future of jobs, skills, and sustainable growth, we are now joined by Professor Mercedes Maroto-Valer, Deputy Principal of Global Sustainability at Heriot-Watt University, and Kathleen Alexander, co-founder and CEO of Savor, a San Jose-based food startup. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
Before we dive into the specifics, I'd like to start with a broader question for both of you. As you look at the discussion, not just today, all the way, what gives you the greatest sense of optimism and what gives you the greatest sense of urgency? To start with you, Kathleen.
Sure. I definitely, for me, am in a moment of feeling some optimism. One of the things when I think about kind of like what the energy transition has looked like, I like to think of us as kind of like a little child growing into an adolescent and working towards becoming an adult. And if you look at kind of over the last 10 to 20 years, we've had some kind of stops and starts, some falls as we've grown through this transition. But we really are in a moment right now where we actually do have a lot of the technologies that we need in order to go through true energy transition. The problem is that we've kind of like fallen down a couple of times along the way. We made some big bets that struggled. We, took a couple of bigger tries at things that then got rolled back. And so there's kind of this moment of both having the tools to succeed, but also kind of fear and recent memory of kind of shifts and wanting to not kind of get ourselves hurt. And so for me, the optimism comes from the actual, technology development that we have at this point kind of like really at our fingertips. But then my sense of kind of urgency is just around the fact that growing to this point has really like taken a lot of time. The clock is ticking. We really have to make urgent action, and I'm not seeing kind of commitment and urgency. I'm seeing more fear and trepidation around people being in a position to make the true kind of big steps that are needed socially. So that's where I'm at.
Yes, so for me, in terms of the optimism comes from, we have seen a shift in the conversations from just being an ambition, something we wanted to do, to something we are doing now, for something that we try to find better ways of doing it or how we accelerated rates of deployment. And I think for me, that's a really positive message. We're not just talking about it, we are doing it. But the flip side of that is that there is, I would say, a widening gap between the technologies that we can deploy and the pace and the scale at which we are doing it. And I think that's really where is a sense of urgency. We have technologies now that we can deploy that are not perfect. Nothing is perfect. Perfection tends to be the enemy of doing good things. But we need to get that pace and scale of technologies. And that's where that urgency is coming in.
Okay, exactly. I think governments and international organizations are trying to think about how to close this kind of gap. So how can we understand this year's theme, which is innovating at scale?
I think it's going back in terms of some of the conversation we have already. We are not lacking ideas. We are not lacking technologies. What we are lacking is more on the implementation side, the deployment, that pace and scale that I'm mentioning. And I think that's really where it comes, the conversations now, that's where it comes, the theme of the meeting here is how do we get these solutions that we know they are working, but we implement them with that sense of urgency that we have discussed.
What about you? What's your understanding of this?
Yeah, ideally, there would be a really critical role for government right now to place some really strong signals, whether on the kind of market creation side of creating the actual kind of carbon trade in marketplaces or on the actual kind of tax side that we're always afraid to put in place. In practice, I think we have the better part of 20, if not 50 years of experience of seeing that governments just do not have the votes to take that kind of action. And so what you're left with, in my view, is the need for this kind of like concerted corporate action, where companies sort of have to all look each other in the eye at the same time, which is not something that companies have been trained to do, and actually show real leadership. Because when individual companies show real leadership, most of the time, not 100% of the time, it just shows up as on their financials, on their balance sheet, sometimes as things that their stockholders don't want to see. And so you need, again, we are in this world where we need kind of concerted action. Governments are not able to, have not proven themselves able to be the kind of like fulcrum of that. And so providing corporations and some other kind of ancillary groups like the World Economic Forum convenes. We see groups like the World Bank and others kind of showing leadership in this space to create the structures that corporations can kind of all come to the table around. So that's kind of like a very broad answer that I think, we're not going to see it from governments, unfortunately. Though, again, I think China actually is a really interesting case, and I think we might get to talk about that.
Yeah, we will talk about this later. So actually, I've got a set of data. The Energy Transition Index published by the World Economic Forum shows that 60% of countries improved their scores, yet transition readiness declined for the first time in more than a decade. So this one goes to you, Kathleen. What does this tell us about where the transition stands today?
Yeah, I think this is exactly a reflection of a combination of our need for the actual financial structures to be able to finance this transition. So that's, again, I think that's where we see this kind of readiness falling short. So you have at the government level, again, in the absence of being able to put, tax structures or true carbon markets in place, what you wind up seeing are governments kind of creating a bunch of kind of technology incubator type ecosystems where you have technologies getting developed, but then you don't have the structures being put in place to actually deploy those. And so I think that's kind of reflective of those two different sides of that coin, is that we have improved some of our scores, but not actually the put in place the mechanisms to be able to go deploy them, as we've been talking about.
For Professor Mercedes, as a member of the UN Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition, you spend a great deal of time looking at how those things happening, the practical ways to net zero. And so from an engineering perspective, what concerns you the most?
I think it's in terms of the concern and the way to look forward as well. I think the solutions that we need to take on board is about the existing or the new technologies that we are developing, is how can we integrate them into existing energy systems. And I think that's going to be quite important in terms of making sure that the energy transition happens. But then I think it's also a point of concern that we discussed as part of the Council of Engineers for the energy transition, is really how do we make sure that these solutions are fair and they're not just concentrated in a few geographical areas of the world, how we can make sure that the transition is just for everybody, and how we make sure that as we go through this energy transition and the transformation that implies, we do it in a way that is not only environmentally responsible and sustainable, but also that we have a resilience and we have prosperity for all involved. And I think that's really what is the challenge going forward, is integration into energy systems, but making it in a way that has pace, scale, but is also fair.
It looks like recent geopolitical tensions really kind of have exposed all of the vulnerability of our energy systems. So for Kathleen, let me bring you in here. As a business leader, you are constantly making decisions on the real world constraints. So from your observation, what is the biggest obstacle that technology cannot solve alone?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we like to tell ourselves a story. We like to come and sit on panels and say, well, actually, the green solution is both the sustainable the solution, as well as the kind of resilient solution, and it can be the most affordable solution at scale. And in practice, there are maybe some examples that we can point to where that is true, but most of the time there are going to be trade-offs. There's going to be tensions among those. And so knowing that, you know, energy security still does have to be a priority for saving people's lives, but then also, you know, balancing those different the different trade-offs. For us in our business, I think we are always looking at what is a solution that is available today. And it's not going to be a perfect solution often, right? As a very concrete example, we have a factory outside Chicago in Illinois in the United States. And that factory is is part of the grid in Chicago, in Illinois, and so it has an energy mix that isn't 100% green. We need heat for our processes, and so today in that factory we use natural gas for our heat. We use and then we use the grid mix in Illinois. We then look at, okay, what is the carbon footprint of that overall facility, and what can we do to mitigate that. Often, today with the factory in the location that it is and the grid that it sits in, that comes in the form of offsets or power purchase agreements for other states that help incentivize, localized transitions. But then also longer term, looking at, okay, if we are going to reduce the footprint of this factory at its next scale or in some future scale, what has to be true for us to be able to use, for example, hydrogen for heating or electricity for heating. And so looking at both, what is available today, what we can implement today, and then what do we think the best solutions for the future will be, and investing in sometimes startups and sometimes partnerships with large companies to make sure that we're on a path to be able to deploy those as they come online.
Do you mean you are able to deploy all of this because of the policy and all the agreements and with the support of it?
Exactly. Yeah. So in practice, if we were to, try to build a perfect factory today to deploy all of those, this is a type of thing that we saw kind of in the last 5 to 10 years when there was more liquidity in the market, that you could be building a company and you could try to build a perfect factory at small scale. And in practice, those were, 100 times too expensive to be able to then, continue to build value in your company past that first step. And so being able to say, okay, today I'm going to do the very best that I can. I'm going to, do better than the status quo, but I'm not going to be able to demonstrate the most perfect version of my process in this iteration. But I'm going to get as far down the field as I can so that we can take that next step together as all of these other technologies scale together.
Professor Mercedes, we just hear how a business leader can, did all of this. So when energy security, affordability, and decarbonization come together, come into conflict, let's use this word, which should governments prioritize first and why?
Well, I actually don't think they come to conflict. I think that sometimes has been a little bit there. We've been like thinking we need to prioritize one over the other, or one is exclusive of the other. And I think that's really what we need to change, the way we look at this. It's important that we keep our climate ambition goals and we realize them. We shouldn't be away or move away from them. But I think it's also we need to understand that countries are unlikely to change their whole energy systems based on one single reason. And I think we have been excluding things of the conversation, and we have been excluding some of the really good reasons why we are doing it. We are creating a number of new technologies as well. We are improving public health. We are improving social jobs. And I think all this is part of the same. So it's not an either or, it's an and that we need to consider here. And really the way we look at the energy transition is a way that is also going to be bringing prosperity, and prosperity for all. And that's what is really important.
According to your observation, you've been working in this area for so many years. Which country is doing this very well?
So I think it will be difficult to say which one is doing this. There are many good things when you look at different countries, how they're approaching. In some cases, some countries have been particularly good in developing business models, in actually adapting and changing the regulatory frameworks as well to make sure these technologies can be deployed. And then we can have, for instance, in the case of China, where we are now, that having that stability on a long-term vision of what is going to happen can also be very beneficial in terms of business and where they decide to invest, particularly because also some of these new technologies, the return of the investment doesn't really happen quickly or overnight. So you need to make sure that you have that policy that gives you certainty and predictability over a number of years.
Okay, so you talked about China, which is the topic that I'm gonna go through. Actually, China's energy transition has attracted global attention already. You've worked extensively across different countries and regions, and China's case is often discussed as a unique one. Has the global conversation overemphasized climate and underestimated these other motivations?
I think it has, for a time, it's true that we were particularly looking for maybe the single dimension or the single angle of climate and climate mitigation. I think now we are putting a little bit more everything in terms of how we balance our climate targets, what we need to deliver in there, how do we actually become more resilient to global shocks as well, and also make sure that there is affordability linked to everything of this. So we need to balance all these three angles of what is called the energy trilemma. And I think what is important is that through that balance exercise, and generally balance exercises are never easy, but we really make sure that we deliver on those three objectives.
Okay, so Kathleen, do you think there's a balance that we need to strike, especially in the US?
Yeah, I absolutely, part of the kind of founding ethos of my company has been that the types of sustainability solutions that we're driving for are a little bit missing the right metrics. So instead of this kind of like one-dimensional climate or carbon equivalent emissions, we come from a line of thinking that actually the thing we really need to be solving for here is planetary health, and having a planet where humans can certainly thrive for centuries and hopefully millennia to come, and actually that many other species will be able to do the same. And that is, if we then kind of reframe this problem, it's interesting, back in the last 100 years, I think the original kind of like environmental movements were maybe framed through this lens, and in the last 10, 20 years, we've kind of shifted in this much more narrow focus. But if we kind of pull back to the lens of planetary health, that actually does bring us to a different mix of solutions. So for example, my company makes fats and oils. We have kind of a very novel process where we're able to do that on a very small land footprint. We can bring in pretty diverse feedstocks in order to drive that process. And the reason that we're doing that is about restoring native ecosystems. And so that's not a solution that the current like carbon accounting, especially if it excludes land use, would solve for. But if you broaden the scope to looking at ecosystem and planetary health, it actually very quickly becomes a really important solution to being able to drive, again, other indices like biodiversity. And so that ideally would be the lens through which we'd look at all of the different technologies in the energy transition, food being kind of critical because it does have such an enormous planetary footprint in the way we use land.
As countries seek to accelerate their energy transition, what lessons from China are genuinely transferable?
Yes, so I think I'm not sure it's completely transferable, because everything when it comes to transfer, you need to really get into the local context. So it's very difficult to take a global solution and implement it across. But I think it's something is very useful in terms of how we can look outside of China, where there is that stability and predictability on the policy and the regulatory markets. And I think whether it's possible to translate that into other countries, that's probably a different conversation. But clearly, it does help for new technologies, making it into the market to understand where is going to be that policy certainty.
From investment and innovation, I guess, Kathleen, you have got a lot to say about this. What is the biggest barrier between ambition and implementation? I mean, we have talked about all of these policies and technologies and even agreements. What's your thought on this?
I actually think that looking at how innovation or how new technologies have scaled in China is actually a really good case study for answering that question specifically. I was in a conversation with somebody here at the forum actually just the other day about this, where I was trying to describe so all of these technologies I mentioned at the beginning that are kind of like ready to scale. We have alternatives to steel and cement and fertilizer and in my case, fats and oils. And in order for those technologies to be deployed and be deployed rapidly, we need to unlock capital. And there's not infinite capital, but there is capital. And there's capital that desperately wants to be deployed in this transition. And it has a very narrow set of constraints. And those constraints certainly look for engineering and technical readiness, but also for a very kind of strict set of market demand kind of signals, typically in the form of these multi-year offtake agreements that demonstrate a surety of cash flows to the folks that would finance these projects. Now, these are projects that typically, right, a cement plant often is actually just built off the balance sheet of an existing cement company. Maybe they have some financing mechanisms, but right, so we're bringing in new financing tools to the ecosystem, and they're asking for offtake agreements that are different than the market currently supports for that. And so essentially now you need your customers to sign something new in order for the banks to do something new. And that gap is actually I was kind of describing this to a colleague who's based here in China, and she was like, oh, well, that actually just is not how you get innovation. You can't get to have a customer, right, commit to an innovative solution for 10 years on a take or pay contract. That, the only things that they would commit to for that type of contract are not innovative. And so what's really interesting in terms of how China has scaled many of these new technologies is that they actually did not require, instead of saying we need a demand signal, we need to see that market pull, they said we're going to push. We're going to give you a market push. And so how do we then replicate that in the rest of the world, in places where I have said we do not have the governmental wherewithal to provide that sort of push? And what we're seeing is, again, kind of new entities trying to mirror that push-pull demand creation. But it's not going to, those corporates, those banks, them on their own are not going to be able to create this ecosystem, particularly with the urgency and movement that we need to see. So I would say, that those kind of other entities within the rest of the economy should really look at how that worked in China and how we can create that signal elsewhere, knowing again that long term, I think there's a chance that government will be able to play a great role in these ecosystems, just not on the timescales we need them to.
But turning breakthroughs into large-scale impact could be a challenge, isn't it?
You mean a technical challenge? Absolutely. But that's what I was saying in terms of, I actually think that a lot of those technologies have been de-risked from a technology standpoint, not every technical solution. But I think that's also part of what we're going to have to see here is a willingness to take a different level of risk than we have historically. And what that means is that some of them will fail, right? It's nice to say, to sit down and say, well, we're just going to have to take some more risk. What I mean is that we're going to have to be willing to see some of these investments fail. And again, from a governmental perspective, when we look at, especially in the U.S., when folks have made big bets, and there have been examples of things that have failed, folks have really suffered for those decisions politically, and so you see again this retreat from in the last 5 years, where instead of making big bets, we made a bunch of small bets, and some of those have been useful, but it hasn't gotten us where we need in terms of deployment.
So gaps are still existing. What's your thought on this, Professor Mercedes?
Well, I think it's one of the things that we need to do in terms of closing that gap is we need to work on this together. So it needs to be, the government clearly has a role in terms of giving us some market signals, in terms of making sure that the policy, the regulatory frameworks are going to be promoting and de-risking the investment. And then we do need also the investors to close that gap that exists when a technology is not fully deployed, but is in quite advanced stages of the development, but is not mature. How do they take that risk, understanding that that can be a long journey? It may not be something that's just going to happen overnight. And then I think also we need, obviously, the adopters of the new technologies and industry to be on board as well and wanting to share a risk. So I think it's important we look at this as a exercise that we all need to come together, that we all need to contribute, and it's through all the different roles that we can play together that actually we'll be able to get these solutions to market. Otherwise, we may have fantastic technologies, but unless you have together the whole, what we call a whole systems thinking that brings together a technology into a solution to market, we are not going to get where we need to be, and we need to be there at a pace that right now we are not delivering.
As you are currently working in the UK, the country where already has a push to expand clean energy employment, and China has done it as well. And do you think the energy transition ultimately be remembered more as a job creator or as a job disruptor?
I think it's a job creator. I think when we look in terms of the energy transition, without a doubt, it's actually the growth opportunity of the century. Now, what we have to understand alongside that is there are going to be disruptions along the way. So this is not going to be plain sailing all the way through. And it's going to be some cases where maybe factories have to reset. We are going to need, in some cases, the workforce to be retrained, reskilled. But definitely is a growth opportunity, and we will see that. I think it's also we need to start considering here one other dimension. It's not only about job creation in the future, it's also about job retention in our industrial heartlands. Because unless we go through an industrial transformation, we are going to see industries closing because they're basically just not competitive. They're not resilient. They're going to be out of business. So it's not only the jobs that we are creating in the future, it's how we get job resilience in the existing jobs.
Could you predict what skills, professions, and workforce capabilities will matter most in the next decade?
It's going to be quite a wide range of jobs. And we did a study we published just over 2 years ago, where we look at all the type of jobs that we will need to actually get industries in the UK to actually become more sustainable and meet our net zero target ambitions. And roughly speaking, there was jobs that you need to consider through what is going to be the construction stage of a number of projects, the deployment, and then the operational going forward. So there are different stages throughout all that process. But roughly what we have as well is about 25% of those were professional jobs, and then 75% was a more general workforce. But there is a description in terms of where those jobs are going to be created, new jobs, re-skilling as well, but also very important as well, when we have a conversation about jobs, we need to have a conversation around skills and training. Do we have or do we need to have the right places to actually train and re-skill? And that was what that study brought also to light, that we need to get jobs, skilled workforce, but we also need to make sure that we have the training alongside that.
Yeah, I've noticed that some people are complaining about the training system is kind of have been left behind. Kathleen, what are you seeing in the United States?
Certainly for the energy transition, this is one that's fundamentally about rebuilding our infrastructure. And so for us, especially in kind of making energy and materials, there's actually a substantial workforce that is needed to just design and build all of that all that kind of like transformational infrastructure. Ideally, when your facilities are actually operating, right, you want to be minimizing your operating costs. So typically when you look at kind of a project delivery and operation plan, you see a huge spike, thousands of workers needed for building out a project, and then under 100 needed for operating it. And so to me, what this really means is about a building up of a construction and design workforce that is going to have to be, building projects all over the country. You'll see these all over the world, really, if we're able to really execute our deployment. This is what we saw, in the 1930s, when these kind of like original infrastructure deployment projects were executed in the U.S. And certainly there is, training required for both of those, for that kind of like build out and deployment. And then a different type of training that's required for actually operating facilities. But the bulk of the jobs will be in the actual build out.
Okay, so we often talk about technology and policy and investment, but ultimately, all the transition, I think, succeeds only if people see themselves in. So, who's lost? I mean, if you had to choose one group whose voice is most absent from today's energy transition debates, who would it be?
I think it will be the people whose lives would be affected most. And I think one of the areas that we have been developing as part of the IDRIC, the Industrial Decarbonisation Research Innovation Centre that we have in the UK, is alongside the technical license to operate that you need to have, is really a social license to operate. And I think that's really important because we have seen far too many projects actually that they were stopped, not because the technology was not working or was not going to deliver, it's because we didn't have that social engagement from very early on. So I think for me, that's something we just need to make sure that we bring to the conversation very, very early on. It's not something about bringing them once a decision has been made. It's really try to make sure they are part of that decision-making process. And for us, this concept of a social license to operate is something that is really critical and we need to embed in the conversations.
Okay, what about the situation in the United States?
For me, there's a couple of key groups that are missing. One is that I think we did have a period where we had much stronger engagement from the incumbent oil and gas and energy sectors. And I think that there has been a little bit of a retreat in terms of the participation of those groups in these conversations. First were vilified, and then we're tried to bring them in, and then in some of the shifts in policy and conversation in the last, especially couple of years, a number of those groups made actually very substantial investments and commitments for being part of a transition and have lost enormous amounts of money in those decisions. And so I feel like I'm watching them kind of sit this one out and would like to have them back at the table. That's a small group, but an incredibly influential group that's really needed for us to make progress. The other group that I would say I think is maybe more relevant for the United States, but I'd be interested if this resonates for you folks in other parts of the world, is that maybe similarly to that, there is kind of a large middling population of folks who are tired and like kind of expecting that nothing's going to change, that we're going to keep having these conversations, we'll have these meetings every year, and one more solar field will get built out, one more project will get demonstrated, but the levels of transformation that are going to be needed just will never be invested in, and they also seem to be sitting this one out. And so we have we're a kind of core of true believers at the table. We have all these technologies that have been developed, and so really needing to earn the trust, I would say, that we're serious and we are committed to moving things forward. To bring those groups back in feels really important for us to make progress. I don't know, again, for you all in your other corners of the world, I don't know if that resonates.
Yeah, so lots and lots of things, and the people needs to be, focused on. Imagine it is 2030. Forget the investment figures, emissions, and all the data, and all the numbers and rankings. What is one human story or everyday scene that would convince you the transition is successful or is working?
So, 2030 is really around the corner. So it's not that far.
4 years.
Yes. And it's also it's interesting that you pick 2030, because when we talk about targets, we seem to be talking about this 2050, right? Seems to be quite far away. But really are the things that we do in this decade that are really critical. If you look in terms of all the different scenarios, is by 2030, we need to halve our emissions. Again, we're just kind of 3-4 years away from that. So it's really critical what we are doing in this decade. And for me, something that it will be really telling in terms of are we doing the right things at the pace and scale? It will be when sustainability is the choice of convenience, that right now is not. Right now, you need to pay a premium if you want to have a product that is more sustainable or has green credentials. If you want to have to make sure that your house is fully sustainable from the point of view of you purchase your electricity. Again, you have to go the extra mile to make sure that that's the case. So if we are able at the consumer behavior, that families and the way we live our everyday is actually that sustainability, it just naturally happens and is embedded, that would be a fantastic signal in terms of where we are in 2030. It still will mean that we have quite a lot of things to do, getting us to 2050, but I think for me that would be the real good signal. We have embedded sustainability as a choice of convenience.
Okay, what about you, Kathleen?
For me, again, this kind of goes in conflict with what I have said is possible and what I think there's currently a willingness to do. But the most powerful signal to me would be that there was a financial mechanism that impacted people's lives that was related to our planetary health. It could be just a carbon marketplace, but it could be something more broad that's more of a nature credit marketplace. But I think if people started seeing financial reflections of those externalities in their daily lives, I would be wildly more optimistic in 2030 than in a situation where we still had not figured that out.
Mm-hmm. So here is the takeaway. Sustainability works when research, businesses, and policy align. With that, we wrap up this edition of Biz Talk. Thanks to our Professor Mercedes Maroto-Valer from Heriot-Watt University and Kathleen Alexander of Savor in San Jose. I'm Ruixin in Dalian. See you next time.
This is CGTN Radio. Hear the difference.